welcome to Something to Talk About. Today on the show, we look back at a time after the war when Guam was trying to recover and many people were trying to rebuild their lives. There's an incident that took place just months after the liberators came to Guam that was so dramatic that it captured even the national eye. But for some reason on Guam, it's a little bit of a blimp, but we do still know the basics of the story. And we're going to be talking to Carla Smith. She's going to document this event, the race riots that happened in Agana on December 24th, 1944. Let's go back in time on that story here on Something to Talk About. Well, welcome to Something to Talk About. Thanks a lot for joining us. Here we are at King's Restaurant at our table, and I'm with my friend Carla Smith. We've talked to Carla quite a few times about other topics, but this one I find to be really interesting. Welcome to Something to Talk About, Carla.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
She's been a guest on Something to Talk About before, and we're going to be talking about a topic that's, I think, widely known, but not necessarily often talked about. We're going back in time to 1944 on Christmas Eve, where there is a documented race riot that took place in Agana. And it's what's really interesting about this story is that this race riot took place when pretty much everybody that was on Guam and survived the war, which had just ended months before, probably didn't know that this was taking place because they were probably doing other things. That's what your research said, right?
Well, there was a lot of things going on at the time. It was during the military buildup, and so they brought a lot of laborers on island, and so there was I guess there's a big adjustment going on with all the new influx of people and with the war drawing to a close, yes.
Yeah. So a lot of local people probably were not paying attention to anything outside what was happening to them.
I can only imagine,
Can
yes.
you? Honestly, but there was a whole level of drama that was taking place amongst the liberators and, like you said, the contractors that were brought in to rebuild Guam for the military.
Yes.
Yeah. The races were blacks and whites.
The conflict for this particular incident was between black and white service members, yes. Black Navy sailors and white Marines.
Do you want to tell us about what your research has shown you? Because you wanted to dig into this a little more, because it was part of her dissertation for her degree from the University of Guam last year.
Yes.
And you were drawing the relationships between locals and blacks who had come in predominantly from the military. That's how they absorbed into the community. And so, hey, Kathy, thank you. That's my friend Kathy. She's also got food for us. So during this dissertation, you had discovered that there was this race riot, but not a whole lot of documentation about it, right?
Correct. I saw one blurb and a couple of things on the internet, but nothing in great detail. And so once I graduated last December, I decided I wanted to look into it more, and I have a colleague who was also discussing race riots, throughout the country, and she gave me a tip, and I got some really good information. I got some detailed information, which is what I was looking for, and I'm really excited about it. It's because it shows different perspectives, not just a little blurb, oh, this riot happened in Guam in 1944, but it's the actual testimony of people who were involved and their perspectives, the white perspective, some of the white service members, some of the black service members, and some of the Chamorros who testified during the court proceedings after the incident.
Because the thing, it went to trial. You said, how many people did it actually engage? How many people were involved in the riot?
Oh, we're talking about like hundreds.
Hundreds. So it was a
But-
full-on brawl.
Yeah,
in-
I mean,
that lasted,
different
you said,
incidents that lasted for about 2
Flare-ups,
days.
flare-ups.
Yes, but the thing had been escalating ever since, you know, the basically the the recapture of the island by the Americans.
There was, in that time of our history, we were obviously Guam was going through what Guam was going through after the war, but we never really thought about what was happening at the time on the U.S. mainland
Yeah,
in 1944.
That's understandable, though.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, we were into our own drama here, but 1944 was not a peaceful time between the races anyway.
Right.
And that had, what's interesting is that found its way across the ocean in a place like Guam, where I don't think the average person really looked at race. Is that what you find?
Yes, that is so true. Like I talk about in my thesis, and a lot of historians can attest to that, is that the military played a major role in exporting racial attitudes from the mainland, and not just here in Guam, but throughout the world. And you'll see incidents of things like this riot or conflicts between black and white service members happening throughout the world, and within the Pacific Rim as well.
Yeah. So the Chamorros, or the people who lived on Guam, or survivors of the war were not necessarily predisposed to the races necessarily.
Right.
So when the military came, they brought in whatever prejudice or discrimination, and that was influential on the locals.
Yes,
whatever they were.
And a really interesting thing about this document is that one of the service members testifies, the black service member says basically that some of the comments from the white service members to the locals about the black service members caused the locals to change their minds or to have misgivings about associating with them. Yeah.
That's kind of interesting.
And it says, because of that, basically, some of the locals snubbed us, because they told them things like, blacks they called them Negroes back then, or colored. That was the terminology used for black people at that time. They are illiterate. They are diseased. If you have kids with them, your babies will have tails. So this is all in the testimony.
It's all in our testimony that Chamorros knew of this kind of information that was being passed to them about blacks.
Right. And so that was one of the complaints that the blacks said.
And what's interesting is these young servicemen were coming from these communities where there was a real big public display of violence against blacks at that time.
Yes, lynching was very, very paramount during that time. Yes.
Yeah. But was it necessary? Was it necessarily that Chamorros were not so much not paying attention as they were just not knowing what was happening on the U.S. mainland at that time? I mean, we certainly didn't have the technology to communicate.
Right, because the dynamics, the racial dynamics, you wouldn't have been really exposed to that unless you'd actually heard something from the people that actually came from the mainland.
To tell you this is what's happening over there.
Yes.
So we got this large community of people in different frames of mind, and some of that stuff was brought over from the mainland and played itself out here for 2 days. And you said that there were deaths, right? There were 2 deaths from both sides.
Yeah, on both sides. But I think it goes even a little bit deeper than that. They brought the attitudes over here between black and white, the racial dynamics, but it also bled over into how the Chamorros were treated. And that's a very important fact that people should note in Guam history, because the African American experience, basically from the mainland, slavery throughout, is the framework for how other people of color were treated. For example, you had segregation, on the mainland. Well, and in slavery, blacks were told they couldn't speak their own language. You couldn't practice your own customs. So all of those things kind of bled over into other groups that were dominated by American society.
Yeah. So Chamorros also had this frame of mind.
Yeah.
That they were also being stifled, and had just been coming from an occupation of the Japanese, where a lot of the practices, the language, and much was already stifled anyway. So this was, a continuation post-war. Wow. So the idea here is that Carla is writing a documentary about this, and we'll talk about that after the break. But also after the break, I think I want to touch on not only just the attitudes that you've researched, but I'm really interested in hearing how the locals became involved so much in the judicial process. So we're going to take a quick break here, and we're with Carla Smith. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Kings and Something to Talk About. My friend Carla Smith is working on a documentary about the race riots that you may have heard of. It was a sort of a dimple in the history post-war because it happened literally months after the liberation of Guam in 1944. We're talking about an event that took place in December.
Yes,
of that
Christmas Eve.
December 24th, and almost July, August, September, October, November, like 5 months past liberation, almost to the date. So maybe a lot of people weren't necessarily paying attention to it. So let's pick up from the part where we've had 2 days of violent fighting, clashing between whites and black servicemen, and then there was obviously at some point it had to come to an end. And so they went around looking for witnesses because there had been a shooting. There had already been 2 deaths, and there is now a Navy investigation.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so they basically started an investigation to determine whether or not there was enough evidence to warrant these service members going to a military court martial, as it's called.
Yeah.
And so they went around and they started a guy named Walter White, who was an award-winning journalist, advisor to the president. He was a war correspondent. He just happened to be in the area doing a story on black servicemen in the Pacific and how they were faring during the war efforts.
Was he at the time the president of the NAACP, or did that come later?
No, he was actually the executive secretary of the NAACP.
Okay.
And the NAACP, for those of you that don't know that, is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It is the nation's oldest civil rights organization, and it was founded in the early 1900s, primarily at that time as a way to, stamp out lynching, which was really paramount in the black community at that time.
Yeah.
And so he came, he was an activist and a journalist and a litigator. He wore many different hats. And he came in 2 days here. He came here to Guam 2 days after the riot. He just happened to be in the area. I think he came from Kwajalein.
Okay, but the interesting thing about him is that he looked like he was white. Was he
Yes.
very fair-skinned?
Yes.
So he was able to infiltrate, right? Make his way through some of these factions to be able to maybe even pose as a white person to get information?
Yes, we called him an undercover brother.
Yeah, yeah.
Basically, that's what he was.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of him on his, can you see that?
Wow. A man called White.
That is his autobiography, and he actually talks about the incident here in
Wow.
Guam. He said what he saw here in Guam was so disturbing that he had to write about it.
Wow.
And but back to what you were saying is, yes, he was what was considered a Negro, called Negro back then, or colored, because he was of mixed heritage, but he was very
He felt very white, yeah.
and so he was what we in the black community call passing. Passing for white.
Okay, yeah.
And he would use his fair skin, his blue eyes and blonde hair, and he infiltrated organizations like the Klan to get information about lynchings and other terrorist crimes that they were doing.
yeah.
Yes, and he would use that and bring it to the NAACP, and they would use it in their court cases. And because of his efforts, they won 21 out of 22 cases at the time when he testified.
Wow.
Because, so he was very brave, courageous, and a lot of time. One time they discovered who he was, and he describes in his autobiography how somebody put him on the first train out of there because they were like,
You're worried that he was going to get killed.
yeah, because they were after him. They were like, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And so.
So he happened to be on Guam, and the case intrigued him enough to write about. But it wasn't his involvement in that trial or in that case actually lead to the convictions of some of these members being overturned?
Well, what happened was when he got here, Like I said, he was here to just kind of scope out the territory about how blacks were being treated in the military and so forth. And when they realized that he was a civil rights activist, because he came here as a war correspondent, you know, as a journalist, when they realized who he was and his credentials, they basically asked him, okay, you know, you're a civil rights expert and you've done all these different cases, famous cases, Scottsboro Boys and things like that.
Yeah.
Would you mind investigating this incident? And he did. And so basically what the documentation that I have is basically a result of the investigation that he did up on the island.
Yeah.
And at the very end, they also asked him to testify and to actually defend a couple of the blacks.
Wow.
Yes.
And so, well, these are the transcripts of the court proceedings, and specifically Antonio C. Menglotnya, who lived in San Ramon, Agana, and he was
On Esperanza Street.
Esperanza Street in Agana, and he was one of the witnesses that was questioned during the trial that led eventually to the conviction of at least some of the service members. This is interesting because these documents you actually had to go find. This is not anywhere archived on Guam, right?
No. I had to send for them because I wanted to get the actual testimony. White mentioned it in his autobiography, but I wanted to get, as a historian, I wanted to get different perspectives.
Yeah.
You know, and just get more details about what happened, and it's a treasure.
So
Yes.
so what was happening is Tony Menglotnya, go through the scene with us. Tony Menglotnya is having a party at his house.
Yes.
On Christmas Eve, just 1944.
on
And partying
Esperanza
at his
Street.
house. Okay,
Yes.
on Esperanza Street. Well, apparently a lot of people were having a party on that street that night.
Yes.
So in this specific scenario, what are they questioning him about?
Well, they're asking him, of course, you know, where he lives and what happened. And he's saying that I live on Esperanza Street, and I was having a party at my house, and I had some black service members there, and we were having fun and talking, whatever. Then some white military policemen came in, and I noticed that one white military policeman had, I noticed that one military policeman had a gun, and he had it in a holster. The shoulder holster or whatever, and that the blacks basically stayed for a little while longer, and they left because, you know, like we said before, there was tension between the black and white service members.
Well, there's also the point that you made that the whites really wanted to stop the blacks from coming into Agana, especially during a social time.
Right.
There was an issue about sundown, leaving by sundown.
Yes, we mentioned that. We talked about that
Yeah.
yesterday about Agana being a sundown town. You know, in the mainland and the States during that time, blacks were allowed to go into the towns to work and to conduct business, but at sundown, usually about 5:30 in the evening, you were not supposed to be in town, you know, because if you did, it would be detrimental to you, you know, health-wise, or they would even lynch you.
Right.
And
So you tried to get out of town.
Right.
Before
So they even have signs. If you look on the internet, they have signs. You know, get out of town by sundown. You know, nigger,
Yeah.
no blacks, no Negroes allowed or whatever.
Yeah.
So they have these signs, and it's all over YouTube. So they
In
try.
but in this particular case, it was also this rivalry because they didn't want these boys to come and take the women or entertain females.
Right.
Right.
That was a big part of it. Yes.
Yeah.
And there's testimony from some of the black servicemen that said, basically, he was a military master at arms, which is law enforcement. He says his co-workers basically said, I don't want you talking to these women. We took over this island. These are our women. You know, get away from here, nigger. Get where you belong. And that's in his testimony. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. So Menglotnya is testifying that he sees these guys, these military police officers come, and so the other guys left.
the
They're
blacks-
invited guests,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay.
And the blacks, when they see them, they stay a little while longer, but there's tension, so
Yeah.
they leave and they go further down the street to another party by name of, I think the man's name was Aflugui.
Aflagui?
Yes.
Okay.
And Nocenio Aflugui.
Okay.
And so they stay there for a while, and a few minutes after they leave, there's testimony that the military policeman that was at Mr. Menglotnya's house followed them. And so when the guys are on their way back to wherever they're going, they encounter the military policeman again, and testimony is that there was some shooting Okay. And so what he's saying here in the testimony, Mr. Manglona, is he's saying I didn't see any shooting because, you know, I was at my house, but I can say that, you know, this guy had a gun, and then later on after they left, I heard shooting, and then later on they bring him into the court proceedings, a guy that was suspected of the shooting, and Mr. Manglona identifies him, and he says that he was the one that had the pistol and the in the shoulder holster.
Now, the guy who had the pistol is the guy that they refer to as Chief.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But he's Native American.
At that time they called him Indian. He was an Apache Indian, but he was part of the military police force.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, you have a whole nother, you know, culture that is introduced into this drama. So the documentary is going to attempt to tell the larger story.
Yes.
With the convictions, with you know, Mr. White's involvement, and then just what was happening at that time, you know, for Guam during the end of this, you know, the war.
Yes.
So this is all going to come together with photos. Do you have photos? Do you have like video, or what do you have?
I have some photos. I'm working on that.
Okay.
Yes.
The photos are a big deal because that, you know, you're filling up a documentary. She's actually raising some funds to do that too, right?
Yes. Yes, I have a GoFundMe account. It's called www.gofundme.com, the Ganya Race Riot. And
Yeah.
we're trying to raise money for it. And we're going to air it on PBS next spring.
Okay. And so there's a lot of writing
Yes,
that
a
still
lot of
has
writing.
to be done.
It's a lot of, because the investigation was 25 days long and about 100 people testified. So when I got the documents, I mean, it came in a big Xerox box, and it's a lot of information to sort through and decide what to put and what's, you know, and what not to put. But it's very challenging, but it's very rewarding too.
Mr. Manglona and Tony Manglona was 25 years old at the time.
Yes.
So he would have long been gone at this point. Are there other people that are related to this story that, or might have have some sort of memory of it, that might still be alive?
Well, that's what I'm looking for. And actually, throughout the documents, some of the people are mentioned. Like he said that he lived with, I have the notes here, with some relatives, Lourdes Tenorio Rivera, Candelaria Tenorio Rivera, Antonia Tenorio Rivera, and then further on in the case, basically a Chamorro named David T. Cruz testifies, Vincente Rosario, Rose Blas. So I'm looking for some people that might know.
And they would have all been up in that general area of the village, up there, which might be kind of Agana Heights as well. Well, I tell you, it's an interesting story, and I can't wait to see how this all pans out. But it's surely a glimpse into our own Guam past, post-war. Email, or somebody can get a hold of you?
Yes, Carla with the C, CARLA.Smith, the number 4 @gmail.com.
Carla.Smith, number 4 @gmail.com. Thank you so much, Carla. I appreciate it. Always interesting when I talk to you.
I'm glad.
All right, that'll do it for us this time on Something to Talk About. We'll see you on the radio.